You learn a lot about a man by the family he keeps. It's a piece of wisdom that sounds like it belongs on a stitched pillow, but when you've worn a correctional officer's uniform for 15 years, you see its truth etched onto the very soul of a place like this. I've seen it in the quiet, unshakable pride of a father visiting his wayward son, his gaze communicating a love that transcends judgment and steel bars. I've witnessed it in the shame-filled, silent tears of a mother whose grief is so profound it seems to absorb the sound in the room. And I've felt the defiant, misguided anger of a brother who sees injustice where there was only consequence. But the reverse is even more telling. You learn everything you need to know about a family by the way they act when they step inside a prison. For most folks, walking into Northwood Correctional Facility is a profoundly humbling experience, a baptism by cold reality. The sheer weight of the steel doors closing behind you, the unnerving electronic buzz of the locks, the sterile, echoing finality of the place. It's an environment designed to strip away the ego. It's a stark, gray reminder that for all the love and support they bring with them, they are merely visitors in a world governed by rules they don't comprehend and consequences they are utterly powerless to control. It forces a reckoning with reality. For most families, that is. But the Martells were not most families. To the Martell family, this prison wasn't a place of sober consequence. It was a gross, bureaucratic inconvenience. It was a temporary holding cell for their beloved son, Adrian, a young man they viewed not as a convicted felon serving a sentence for aggravated assault, but as a tragically misunderstood victim of a deeply, systemically flawed judicial system. And I, Officer Daniels, was just another component of that flawed system. A faceless cog in a machine they despised. A glorified, overpaid babysitter clad in a drab gray uniform, a person to be tolerated, managed, and, when the mood struck them, to be openly and viciously mocked. They carried themselves with a deep-seated belief that they were untouchable. They genuinely figured that their considerable money, their army of aggressive lawyers, and their web of powerful connections placed them far above the grimy, unyielding reality of the world I inhabited every single day. And for a painfully long time, they were frighteningly close to being right. The families of the inmates I was assigned to watch over used to laugh directly in my face during visitation hours, utterly and completely convinced that their wealth and connections rendered them immune to the rules that governed everyone else. They didn't just bend the rules, they tried to shatter them, and me along with them. They filed a blizzard of complaints, one after another, a relentless paper assault, telling anyone in a position of authority who would listen that I was a dirty, abusive officer on a power trip. For months, I just took it. I stood there, absorbed their contempt, and clung to the belief that the truth, my unblemished record, would be my shield. Then came the day that shield shattered. The day an investigator from Internal Affairs stood directly in front of my locker in the staff-changing room, his face an unreadable mask, and told me in a flat, dead voice to hand over my badge. The inmates' families, the Martells, had almost won. They thought the game was over. They thought they had broken me. But right as my fingers reached for the clasp of my badge, the symbol of my 15 years of service, I decided it was finally time to tell the investigator a little secret I'd been holding on to. A secret that wouldn't just stop him cold in his tracks, but would bring the Martells' entire glittering, corrupt world crashing down around them. To truly understand the Martells and the poison they dripped into my life, you first have to understand the world they hated with every fiber of their being. The Northwood Correctional Facility is your typical state-run institution, a sprawling monument to failed hopes and bad decisions. It is a universe painted in 100 miserable shades of gray and institutional beige, a place where the primary sounds are the relentless, lonely echo of footsteps on polished concrete floors, the distant, jarring clang of steel on steel, and the low, constant, almost subliminal hum of human tension. I'd walked these halls for a decade and a half. I was no longer a wide-eyed rookie, a cowboy, as the seasoned inmates contemptuously called them, eager to prove myself. Nor was I a jaded, bitter veteran, endlessly counting down the days to a meager pension. I was a professional. I believed in the fundamental necessity of the job. Not necessarily in the punishment aspect, but in the order. In a world specifically designed for chaos, I saw myself as an agent of structure, a provider of predictability in a place where predictability was the only form of currency that truly mattered. My guiding philosophy was simple, honed over thousands of days of observing human nature at its rawest: firm, fair, and consistent. I treated every single inmate the same, regardless of the crime that brought them here, the crew they ran with on the inside, or the attitude they projected. Respect is a two-way street, to be sure, but on my side of the bars, You earn it not through favors or fear, but by being the same man every single day. I knew the rulebook by heart, not just the words but the intent behind them. I could instantly discern the difference between an inmate who was genuinely having a bad day and one who was methodically testing the boundaries, looking for a weakness. I had learned early on that a quiet, direct word often achieved more than a loud, aggressive command, and that the most dangerous moments weren't the spectacular riots you see in movies, but the simmering, loaded silences in the chow hall or the dead-eyed, hollow stares across the yard. The visitation room was its own unique and particularly challenging brand of theater. It's a bizarre, emotionally charged space where two completely separate worlds collide head-on. On one side of the thick plexiglass, you've got the inmates, stripped of their street clothes, their freedom, and their identity, desperately trying to project an image of strength and resilience for their loved ones. On the other side, you have the families, often dressed in their Sunday best as if trying to impose a sense of normalcy on a profoundly abnormal situation. They arrive trying to bridge the impassable gap of steel and glass with whispered conversations, forced smiles, and overpriced snacks from a vending machine. It is a room heavy with the weight of things left unsaid, saturated with grief, with desperate hope, and, most palpably, with a deep, pervasive sense of failure. My job in that room was to be a ghost. A watchful, silent, ever-present specter. My purpose was to ensure the rules were followed. No overly intimate contact, no passing of contraband, conversations kept at a volume that respected the privacy of others. The majority of families understood this. They knew we were there for the security of everyone, not to eavesdrop on their private heartbreaks or to pass judgment. They would offer a polite, perfunctory nod or a tight-lipped, weary smile and then turn their entire focus to the precious, fleeting 2 hours they had with their son, brother, or husband. The Martells were different. Radically, fundamentally different. They arrived for their very first visit to see their son, Adrian, carrying themselves as if they were attending a parent-teacher conference for a brilliant child who had been given detention by a foolish, incompetent teacher. First, there was Mr. Martell, a man in his late 50s with a soft, fleshy face that seemed permanently frozen in an expression of mild, weary annoyance. He wore impeccably tailored suits that looked utterly ridiculous in the sterile, unforgiving environment of the visiting room. His expensive leather shoes clicked with a sharp, arrogant rhythm on the cheap linoleum floor, a sound that consistently cut through the quiet, somber murmurs of the other families, drawing resentful glances. Then there was Mrs. Martell. She was the true artist of their shared contempt. Tall, rail-thin, with a helmet of perfectly coiffed hair that seemed immune to humidity and gravity. She wielded a stare that could peel paint off the walls. She carried a designer handbag that was likely worth more than my 10-year-old sedan, and she looked at every surface, every other family, and especially every officer with a look of undisguised, visceral disgust. They were a tiny, self-contained island of immense privilege in a vast, unforgiving ocean of state-issued consequence. Their son, Adrian, was serving a 5 to 7 year sentence for a particularly brutal aggravated assault. On the cell block, away from his parents, he was just another number, inmate number 73482, who had to learn the harsh rules of survival. But during those Saturday visits, he underwent a startling transformation. He was no longer a convict. He was their brilliant, promising boy, Adrian, who had simply made a single, youthful mistake. The mocking started small, like a series of probing attacks testing for weaknesses. A subtle, condescending smirk from Mrs. Martell as I recited the standard rules about physical contact. A dismissive, airy wave from Mr. Martell when I politely asked him to place his absurdly expensive gold watch in a locker. "Surely you don't think this cheap little thing is a security risk, officer," he'd said, his voice dripping with a syrupy, patronizing condescension that made my teeth ache. Over the next few months, their behavior escalated. It wasn't just an attitude anymore. It became their weekend hobby. Tormenting Officer Daniels was part of their visitation ritual. I vividly remember one particular Saturday afternoon. Mrs. Martell marched directly to the officer station, her high heels clicking on the floor like a pair of angry castanets. "Officer," she began, her voice pitched just loud enough for the entire room to hear, ensuring she had an audience. "The snack machine has just consumed my $1. I expect to be reimbursed immediately." I calmly explained, as I had to others countless times, that the machines were owned and operated by a third-party vendor and that there was a contact number printed on the side of the machine she could call for a refund. She just stared at me, her eyes narrowing. "Young man," she said, the words sharp and clipped, Do you have any conceivable idea who we are? We are not calling a number. You are going to open that machine with your keys and retrieve my dollar. Ma'am, I don't have the authority or the keys to do that. It's against institutional policy, I replied, my voice deliberately flat, betraying no emotion. Policy, she scoffed, making the words sound like something foul she had stepped in. Your policies and your incompetence are the very reason my son is being held in this disgusting, squalid place. Incompetence appears to be the prevailing theme here. Throughout this entire exchange, Adrian just sat at his designated table, grinning, basking in the performance. He was what we called a cell warrior, endlessly tough and belligerently mouthy when his parents were there to back him up, but meek, quiet, and obedient when he was back on the block among the general population. The other families in the room would shift uncomfortably in their seats, looking down at their hands. They all knew the great unwritten rule of visitation: you don't make waves. The Martells didn't just make waves, they tried to create a tsunami. They soon progressed to filing petty, formal complaints. It's a common tactic used by inmates and their families to harass and bog down staff, but the Martells elevated it to a veritable art form. Their lawyers, a high-priced firm from the city, would transform the most trivial grievances into multi-page, formally worded letters threatening legal action. One week, I received a formal write-up because Mr. Martell filed a complaint alleging I was staring at his wife with inappropriate and lascivious intent. The camera footage, of course, showed me methodically scanning the entire room, which was the most fundamental part of my job. The complaint was eventually dismissed, but the accusation itself still went into my permanent file. A small, but indelible stain. Another time, Mrs. Martell claimed I deliberately and maliciously ended their visit 5 minutes early out of sheer spite. The official logs clearly showed they had checked in 10 minutes late, shortening their own visit. Again, the complaint was dismissed, but the paperwork had to be meticulously filed. The questions had to be asked. My sergeant, a good and decent man named Peterson who was nearing retirement, would just wearily shake his head in his office. "Just keep your head down, Daniels," he'd advise me, his voice heavy. "They're just trying to get a rise out of you. Don't you dare take the bait." So, I followed his advice to the letter. I became a stone wall, a blank slate. I was unfailingly polite, rigorously professional, and completely impossible to read. When Mr. Martell made a snide crack about my civil servant salary, I would simply nod. When Mrs. Martell launched into a tirade about the cleanliness of the plexiglass divider, I would calmly make a note on my clipboard. I gave them absolutely nothing, and I believe that infuriated them more than anything else possibly could. They were people who were accustomed to reactions, to people fawning over them or fearing them because of their money. My steadfast refusal to play their twisted game was a fundamental rejection of their perceived power. They saw me as a nobody, part of the grim, gray, ugly furniture. They mocked me, they filed endless complaints, and they actively tried to use their influence to make my professional life a living hell. They did all of this with the smug, unshakable certainty of people who have never once in their lives faced a real, meaningful consequence. They thought they were playing a game with some dumb, powerless prison guard. But they didn't know that my greatest asset is my power of observation. It's the most critical skill for a correctional officer. You watch. You listen. You learn to notice the small things, the tiny details that are out of place. And over the course of a year of their bi-weekly visits, I had started noticing some very small, very strange things about the otherwise untouchable Martell family. And I started taking my own notes. The Cold War that existed between me and the Martells simmered and festered for the better part of a year. It settled into a miserable, predictable routine. Every other Saturday, they would arrive like clockwork, put on their grand performance of arrogance and indignation, and leave a fresh new complaint in their wake like a calling card. The complaints became progressively more personal and more dangerous. They were no longer about malfunctioning vending machines or imaginary slights. They began to methodically paint a detailed, sinister picture of a corrupt, abusive, and threatening officer. They accused me of deliberately misplacing critical paperwork related to Adrian's appeal process. They lodged a formal grievance stating I was restricting his access to phone calls as a form of personal punishment. They even filed a complaint claiming I used threatening language, a vague and insidious accusation that is nearly impossible to disprove. Each baseless claim, no matter how ludicrous, triggered another small, time-consuming internal process. A formal chat with my supervisor, a detailed written statement from me, a painstaking review of hours of camera footage. And each and every time, I was cleared of any wrongdoing. But the sheer, cumulative volume of the complaints was creating a damaging narrative. In a large bureaucracy, perception can often morph into a form of reality. A thick folder overflowing with accusations, even if every single one is dismissed, looks terrible. I was becoming a problem for the administration, not because I had done anything wrong, but because the Martells were relentlessly and skillfully making me one. My co-workers, many of whom I'd considered friends, started treating me differently. Not with open hostility, but with a cautious distance. I was now the guy with the problem family. Conversations in the break room would sometimes falter and die when I walked in. They were good officers, but they had their own careers and families to protect. No one wants to get hit by the shrapnel from someone else's drama, especially when that drama involves rich, notoriously lawsuit-happy outsiders. The toll was mounting. I began to feel profoundly isolated, a creeping anxiety gnawing at me, the fear that the truth was no longer a strong enough shield. The moment everything transitioned from a chronic, manageable problem into a full-blown crisis occurred on a sweltering, suffocating Saturday in the middle of August. The visitation room was packed, the air thick and heavy with the cloying smell of industrial floor wax and cheap, burnt coffee. The Martells were at their usual table, but today, the energy emanating from them was different. There was a triumphant, almost predatory glint in Mrs. Martell's eyes that I hadn't seen before. Mr. Martell looked even smugger and more self-satisfied than usual. A tight knot formed in the pit of my stomach. Something was coming. Something bad. Halfway through the 2-hour visit, Mrs. Martell abruptly stood up and walked directly to my station, deliberately stepping over the yellow designated line painted on the floor, a clear and conscious breach of protocol. "Officer Daniels," she said, her voice low but sharp enough to cut glass. "We need to have a word." "Ma'am, please step back behind the line," I said, focusing on keeping my tone perfectly level and professional. She let out a short, harsh, ugly laugh. "Oh, I don't think so. The time for you to be giving me orders is officially over." She leaned in close, so close I could smell her expensive perfume, and dropped her voice to a conspiratorial whisper that was somehow louder and more menacing than a shout. "My husband has a very, very good friend on the State Corrections Oversight Committee. A very powerful and influential friend. We had a lovely dinner with him and his wife just last night." An icy chill snaked its way down my spine. This was no longer a petty grievance. This was a direct, unambiguous threat. She continued, savoring every word. "We talked all about you. We discussed your extracurricular activities. We talked about how you find ways to supplement your meager salary. We talked at length about how you use your position of authority to bring unauthorized items into this facility for a fee." This was it. This was the endgame. The ultimate accusation they had been building towards for a year. Smuggling contraband. The cardinal, unforgivable sin for any correctional officer. The one charge that could instantly vaporize my career, my pension, and potentially put me on the other side of the very bars I guarded. It was a complete and utter lie, but a devastatingly effective one. "That's a very serious and entirely false accusation, ma'am," I said, my voice coming out tighter than I wanted. "Is it?" she purred, a cruel, vicious smile playing on her lips. Our friend on the committee didn't seem to think so. He found our story quite compelling. In fact, he assured us an official inquiry would be opened. Monday morning, to be exact. She then gestured dismissively back towards her son. "Adrian tells us you've been particularly hard on him this past week. Denying him his scheduled yard time. Shaking down his cell for no reason. That behavior stops. From this moment forward, my son is to be treated with the respect he deserves. He gets extra phone time. He gets preferential treatment on his cell block. If there are any problems at all, any at all, I make one more phone call. And that inquiry becomes a full-blown criminal investigation. Do you understand me, Officer Daniels?" The entire room had fallen silent. Every family, every inmate, was watching this drama unfold. They had all heard her. This wasn't just a threat, it was a public execution. She was marking me, establishing her dominance in front of the very population I was supposed to control. I could feel dozens of pairs of eyes on me, weighing me, judging my response. In the brutal world of a prison, the perception of weakness is a death sentence. I looked at her triumphant, hateful smirk, at the sheer entitlement that radiated off her like heat. I looked over at Mr. Martel, who gave me a small, condescending nod of confirmation. I looked at Adrian, his chest puffed out, looking around at the other inmates with an expression of pure, unadulterated victory on his face. I had two choices, and two choices only. I could fold, give in to her demands, and become their personal puppet on the inside. In doing so, I would lose all authority, all respect, and my career would be over anyway, just more slowly and painfully. Or I could stand my ground, call her bluff, and face the hurricane that was scheduled to make landfall on Monday. I stood up slowly, deliberately. I looked Mrs. Martel directly in the eye. "Your visit is over," I said, my voice as cold and hard as the steel of the doors. "Please proceed to the checkout area." Her smile vanished instantly, replaced by a mask of incandescent rage. "You can't do that." "I can, and I am." "You just openly threatened a state correctional officer in a room full of witnesses. That is a major violation of visitation policy. Your family's privileges are terminated for today." "No." For one terrifying second, I thought she might actually swing her ridiculously expensive handbag at my head. The fury in her eyes was startling in its intensity. But Mr. Martel, suddenly looking a lot less smug and a lot more concerned, grabbed her by the arm. "Eleanor, not here," he hissed, pulling her back. "He's taken the bait. It's done. Let's go." She shot me one last look of pure, unadulterated hatred. "You will regret this for the rest of your life, officer. I promise you that." They stormed out of the room, leaving a stunned, echoing silence in their wake. Adrian was immediately cuffed and escorted back to his housing block, screaming threats and profanities the entire way. As I stood there, my heart hammering against my ribs, I knew they weren't bluffing. An investigation was coming, and it was going to be serious. Sergeant Peterson came over, his face grim and etched with worry. "You did the right thing, Daniels. But you better be damn ready. Hell is coming for you." He was right. On Monday morning, the call came down from the administration building. "Report to the warden's office." Immediately. The storm had arrived. That walk to the warden's office felt like the longest, loneliest walk of my entire life. Every corner I turned, every officer I passed, I saw the knowledge in their eyes. Some gave me a quick, supportive nod. Others, the majority, just looked away, their faces a complicated mixture of pity and self-preservation. News in a prison travels faster than fire in a dry forest. Everyone knew the Martels had finally made their big move. The warden, Marcus Thorne, was a career political animal, far more concerned with budgets, public relations, and avoiding lawsuits than with the day-to-day grind of corrections. He greeted me with a face that looked like it had been carved from stone. Sitting across from him in a stiff leather chair was a man I didn't know. Late 40s, wearing a nondescript suit, with the kind of calm, predatory stillness you only see in seasoned interrogators and hunters. He didn't smile. He just watched me, his eyes cold and analytical. "Officer Daniels," Warden Thorne began, his voice devoid of any warmth or support. "This is Investigator Miller from Internal Affairs." Miller gave me a single, curt nod, a gesture of acknowledgement, not greeting. His eyes swept over me from head to toe. It wasn't an assessment, it was a judgment. He had already made up his mind about me. "Investigator Miller is here to look into some extremely serious allegations that have been made against you," Thorne continued, his gaze fixed on a point on the wall just over my shoulder. "Allegations of professional misconduct, dereliction of duty, and, most seriously, introducing contraband into this facility for financial gain." I stood there, my posture ramrod straight, my hands clasped behind my back. "I understand, Warden. And I can state for the record that those allegations are completely and demonstrably false." Miller leaned forward in his chair, his voice smooth, almost gentle, which was far more unnerving than if he had been shouting. "Officer Daniels, I've spent the last 2 hours conducting a thorough review of your service file. It's thick." He let that single word hang in the air between us like a thick fog. "Dozens of formal complaints. what appears to be a clear and sustained pattern of harassment, according to the Martel family. And now, a sworn statement from a credible source alleging your direct involvement in a smuggling operation. A credible source, who happens to be the parent of an inmate I've had to repeatedly discipline? A family that has been actively trying to get me fired for the better part of a year. I shot back, unable to keep a sharp edge out of my voice. A family with considerable standing in the community, Miller replied, his voice hardening, the false gentleness gone. A family with a close personal relationship with a respected member of the State Oversight Committee. Are you suggesting that they are all conspiring against you, officer? That a respected public servant would risk his entire career and reputation on a frivolous, baseless claim? It was the perfect, elegant trap. If I denied it, I was effectively accusing a powerful state official of corruption without a shred of proof. I was cornered. The weight of my 15 years of dedicated service felt like it was dissolving into nothing under his piercing, accusatory gaze. I am suggesting, I said carefully, choosing my words with extreme precision, that the Martel family is manipulative and has a history of using their influence to intimidate people who won't bend to their will. All you have is their word against mine. We have more than that, Miller said, and for the first time, a flicker of triumph showed in his eyes. We have a pending transfer of funds. A source has informed us that a significant payment is scheduled to be made to a known associate of yours later this week. A payment for services rendered. Fits the narrative perfectly, doesn't it? My mind was reeling. They hadn't just made an accusation, they had meticulously manufactured evidence to support it. They were building a cage of intricate lies around me, and the door was swinging shut with alarming speed. The interview, or rather, the interrogation, lasted for another grueling hour, a masterclass in psychological warfare. Miller twisted my words, reframed my professional actions, and painted every single decision I'd ever made regarding the Martels as part of a larger, criminal puzzle. I went home that evening in a complete daze. The world outside the prison walls seemed strange and alien. People were laughing in restaurants, going about their lives, utterly oblivious to the fact that my own life was imploding. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Investigator Miller's smug face and heard the echo of Mrs. Martel's voice promising my ruin. The next 2 days were a unique form of purgatory. I was placed on administrative leave, forbidden from setting foot on prison grounds or speaking with any of my colleagues. I was a pariah, an outcast from the only professional world I had ever known. On Wednesday morning, the call came. It was Miller's assistant. Investigator Miller wanted to see me. Back at the facility. I knew exactly what that meant. It was over. I put on my uniform one last time. It felt different. Impossibly heavy. Suffocating. I drove to the prison, the familiar route feeling completely alien, like a man walking the last mile to his own execution. Miller had told me to meet him by my locker in the staff-changing area. The symbolism was brutal and obvious. This was where he was going to finish me, strip me of my identity. He was leaning casually against the bank of metal lockers, holding a small, clear plastic evidence bag. My heart sank into my stomach. He had his proof, whatever fabrication the Martels had cooked up. "Officer Daniels," he said flatly, his voice devoid of any emotion, "the investigation is concluded." He didn't have to say anything more. The look of finality on his face said it all. "Before we proceed to the warden's office, I'm going to have to ask for your badge and your service weapon." This was it. The moment of total and utter defeat. 15 years of service, of dedication, erased by a rich family's lie. All my commendations, all the times I had de-escalated violent situations, all the good I had tried to do, all of it gone, reduced to ash. I looked at Miller, at his smug, self-satisfied face. He thought he'd won. The Martels thought they'd won. But as my hand reached for the badge pinned to my chest, a strange, unexpected sense of calm washed over me. The gut-wrenching anger and the crushing despair faded away, replaced by a cold, sharp, crystalline clarity. They had underestimated me at every turn. They saw a simple prison guard. They didn't see the man who, for the past year, had been meticulously observing and documenting every tiny inconsistency in their perfect, curated lives. They thought this was their story, their victory. They were dead wrong. It was time to show them, and Investigator Miller, that it was mine. I paused, my hand hovering just over my badge. I looked Investigator Miller straight in the eye. "Before I do that," I said, my voice suddenly steady and clear, all the previous tremors gone, "I think there's something you need to see. You've spent this entire time investigating me based solely on the word of the Martell family. Did it ever occur to you, even for a single second, to investigate them?" Miller scoffed, an arrogant, dismissive sound. "My job is to investigate employee misconduct, Daniels, not to vet the personal lives of visitors. They are respected members of society. You are an officer under suspicion. Now, the badge." "In a minute," I replied, turning my body to face my locker. The loud click of the lock sounded deafening in the tense silence of the empty room. "You're right, they have standing in the community. They have influence. But you're so intensely focused on the picture they painted for you that you never bothered to look at the frame." I reached deep into my locker, past my neatly folded spare uniform and my lunchbox, to a plain, unmarked manila envelope tucked away in the very back. My own private investigation file. I pulled out the thick envelope. "For the last year, Investigator, I have done nothing but listen to the Martells talk during their visits. Arrogant people have a desperate need to boast. They talk about their businesses, their exotic vacations, their valuable assets. They do it to constantly remind everyone in that room, the other families, the staff, their own son, that they are better than all of us." I took out a small, stapled stack of papers. "This," I said, holding it out, "is a public record of their declared assets from a messy civil lawsuit they were involved in 3 years ago. Standard stuff for wealthy people. Properties, stock portfolios, and a holding company named Martell Global Imports." I then pulled out a second document from the envelope. "And this is the standard visitor application form they filled out to be approved for visits. You sign it under penalty of perjury. It's usually just a formality. Nobody ever really checks the details. But I did." I handed him their application form. "Look at Mr. Martell's declared employer. Self-employed consultant. Incredibly vague. But now look at the business address he listed. It's just a P.O. box. Seems a little odd for a company with 'global' in its name, don't you think?" Miller looked down at the form, then back up at me, his expression a mixture of skepticism and burgeoning curiosity. "What's your point, Daniels?" "My point," I said, handing him a new set of papers from my envelope, "is that Martell Global Imports does have a physical address, according to state business filings. It's a derelict, supposedly abandoned warehouse down by the old city docks. But here's the thing. They're still paying property taxes on it. Why would a wealthy family continue to pay taxes on a worthless, decaying building?" I let that question hang in the air for a moment. So, I kept digging in my spare time. The Martells have a second, undeclared holding company. A classic shell corporation, registered offshore. And that shell company has been making regular, monthly payments for the lease on that abandoned warehouse. They're also the silent, unlisted partner in a regional trucking company. A trucking company that, about a year ago, had 2 of its drivers arrested at the southern border. The charge wasn't drugs. It was smuggling. Specifically, counterfeit pharmaceuticals. High-end, life-saving medications for cancer and other critical illnesses, replaced with chalk and sugar pills. It's part of a massive, ongoing federal investigation." Miller's face had gone ghost white. The color drained from it as if a plug had been pulled. He was no longer looking at me like a target. He was looking at me like a crucial asset. "But here's the best part," I said, my voice dropping to almost a whisper. "You mentioned their powerful friend on the State Oversight Committee. Let's call him Mr. Henderson. I did a little bit of public records research on him, too. It turns out, his wife has a rare, debilitating medical condition. A condition that requires one of the exact, incredibly expensive medications that the feds are investigating as part of that counterfeit ring. He's been paying for it out of pocket for years, but according to his own public financial disclosures, he can't possibly afford it. Not the real version, anyway." I pulled out the last piece of paper from my envelope. It was a photograph I'd printed from the society pages of a local magazine's website. In it, a beaming Mr. and Mrs. Martell are smiling for the camera, holding champagne flutes at a charity gala. standing right next to them, his arm slung casually around Mr. Martell's shoulder like an old friend, is their powerful contact, Mr. Henderson. "So you have a choice, investigator," I said, laying the photograph gently on top of the stack of documents in his hand. "You can see the truth now. The Martells aren't just smuggling counterfeit drugs, they're actively using their political connections, the very same ones they leveraged to come after me, to protect their entire criminal operation. Their friend isn't helping them because they're respectable citizens. He's helping them because he's a customer. He's compromised. They got scared. They saw a quiet, observant correctional officer who was always watching, always listening, and they panicked. They knew, on some level, that I was putting the pieces together. They had to get rid of me before I saw the whole picture." I tapped the papers in his hand with my index finger. "Their elaborate plan to frame me? The supposed payment for contraband you heard about? That was the cover-up. The accusation wasn't the crime. The accusation was their desperate attempt to hide their real crimes." Investigator Miller stood completely frozen, staring at the documents as if they were a venomous snake. The smug, bureaucratic certainty was completely gone, replaced by a look of utter, profound shock. He looked from the papers up to my face, and for the very first time, he truly saw me. Not as a suspect, not as a problem to be dealt with, but as a professional who had just single-handedly unraveled a massive criminal conspiracy and handed him the case of a lifetime. The power dynamic in the room hadn't just shifted, it had been completely and irrevocably inverted. He slowly, carefully, folded the papers and tucked them securely inside his suit jacket. He looked at my badge, still pinned firmly to my chest. He took a deep, steadying breath. "Officer Daniels," he said, his voice now laced with a tone of deep, newfound respect. "Forget about the badge. Tell me everything." The interrogation room, which had been my personal hell just 2 days before, was now my command center. Miller was no longer my accuser. He was my rapt student. He pulled in another senior investigator from his unit, and for the next 6 hours, I walked them through everything, every overheard conversation, every observation, every piece of public record I had painstakingly gathered over the past year. At one point, Miller made a phone call to a contact he had in a federal agency. His side of the conversation was clipped and professional. "Yes, I need you to cross-reference the Federal Task Force on Counterfeit Pharmaceuticals with a name. Henderson, Henderson, currently on the State Corrections Oversight Committee." "Yes, I'll hold." He listened intently for several minutes, his eyes widening with each passing second. He hung up the phone and looked at me, a look of sheer astonishment on his face. "They've been looking at Henderson for months. They knew he was dirty, but they could never find his source. You just connected all the dots for them, Daniels. You handed them the entire network. The internal affairs investigation against me was immediately and officially closed. My service record, Miller assured me with a firm handshake, would be completely expunged of any mention of the Martell complaints." Warden Thorne suddenly reappeared in the hallway, all fake friendliness and oozing relief, shaking my hand vigorously and talking about my keen instincts and dedication to the truth. I knew he was just overjoyed that the threat of a massive, high-profile Martell lawsuit was now permanently off the table. I went back to work the very next day. The whispers that had followed me down the corridors were replaced with quiet, respectful nods. Sergeant Peterson pulled me aside in the break room, a wide, genuine grin spreading across his tired face. "Heard you fought the law, and you won," he said, slapping me firmly on the back. "Never had a single doubt, Daniels. It wasn't just vindication, it was a complete restoration of my identity, my standing among my peers. The fallout for the Martells was not immediate, but when it came, it was absolute and catastrophic. About 3 weeks later, the news broke. Federal agents had raided the sprawling Martell home at dawn. It was the lead story on every local news website. And there they were, Mr. and Mrs. Martell, caught on camera in their silk pajamas and handcuffs, their faces pale and utterly shocked as they were led out of their magnificent mansion. Their carefully constructed air of untouchable privilege had evaporated in the morning light, leaving only the sordid, pathetic reality of 2 common criminals getting caught. Their powerful friend on the Oversight Committee resigned the very same day, citing sudden health reasons. He was quietly arrested a week later. The effect on their son, Adrian, was profound and immediate. The source of his power, his arrogance, His entire identity within the prison was gone in an instant. His commissary account, once overflowing with his parents' money, was frozen. His high-priced lawyers vanished, their retainers unpaid. He was no longer Adrian Martel, the misunderstood victim from a powerful family. He was just inmate number 73482, a nobody with no one and nothing on the outside. The swagger went first. He became quiet, withdrawn, almost invisible. The other inmates, who had once looked at him with a mixture of envy and fear, now looked at him with something far worse, open pity. He had lost the one thing that matters more than anything on the inside, respect. His fall from grace was far more total and complete than mine ever threatened to be. My life went back to normal, but it was a new kind of normal. I still walk the same gray halls, I still manage the same daily routines. I still man the visitation room on the weekends. New families come and go, bringing their own packages of hope and grief. I treat them all with the same quiet, professional courtesy. Firm, fair, and consistent. But something inside me had settled. I had faced the ultimate test of my career, not a violent riot, but a systematic, insidious assault on my character and my integrity. I had been dragged through the mud and had not only survived but prevailed, not by breaking the rules, but by understanding them better than my enemies ever could. Sometimes, a new family comes in, a little too loud, a little too sure of themselves. They look at my simple gray uniform, and I see that familiar flicker of condescension in their eyes. They don't know the story behind my calm demeanor. They don't know that I understand, better than most, that the truth is the quietest but heaviest weapon of all. And as I watch them, I feel a quiet, settled sense of peace. Because I know that in this world of gray and echoes, the ones who are truly untouchable aren't the ones with the most money or influence. They're the ones who simply do their job, day in and day out, and always, always pay attention.